She did actually disagree with you on a specific thing, still thank you.
All right, good morning, folks. We are back again. It's Wednesday, February 7th. And this is the second half of the morning for Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're continuing our work on SB 13, and we've been taking a deep dive on maps, mapping, and regulatory programs that are attached to those maps. So, Mr. Fudge, if you want to continue with us, that would be great. And I think I left us with the who shot JR question, which is what is the we're talking about what's the appropriate municipal role in engaging with like state government over these maps?
Yeah. Well, I think it's broader. Rebecca mentioned when the state review of a project occurs, and there is no state jurisdiction for the corridors or municipal jurisdiction. There's the outreach to the community that you're meeting your minimum flood hazard standards, inundation. By the way, you're in a river. This is going to be in a river corridor, and there's hazard. And so there is that advisory interaction that occurs around river corridor development with municipalities, and then it's up to them to move on that.
But there's no obligation for them to say, oh, well, we didn't pay attention to river corridors before, but now we're going to see your maps and get that.
And again, Rebecca can, through her vast experience, can maybe answer this better than myself, but there's no, there may not be any legal way for a community to stop a development in the river corridor if they don't have the bylaw in place. They might advise the developer, oh, by the way, the state told us you're in a very hazardous place, and then maybe a voluntary action. But if the developer wants to forward with something structured in the river corridor, and there's neither state or local jurisdiction regulations, then they likely go forward.
Thank you. Oh, and Rob has his hand up.
Thank you again for the record, Rob Evans, A&R Rivers program. It's worth reminding, and I think you've heard this in previous testimony, that we work to create incentives for municipal adoption of river corridors through the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund after Irene, with amendments to that rule to create a much larger state contribution to their flood recovery dollars for the state FEMA match. And so we saw some uptake for a few years after that rule was created, but it's flatlined since. And I think it really goes to what Senator White said earlier in a similar but different way, which is I just think there's a lack of political will for towns to layer additional land use regulations on top of their existing flood hazard area regulations.
Yeah, very cool. Political will that's a good way to put that, versus capital.
Yeah. All right. So I don't know if you had a few more slides. Do you want to resume your deck?
It seemed like they were additional slides.
It was an additional slide just showing the construct on a real river. I can reboot that if you'd like.
No, I mean, we all have copies.
This basically goes through a scenario where the river is going next to a railroad, and how is that river corridor bumped off of that railroad to again maximize the space for the river where possible. It's just a real life example of how that bumping process occurred, and it took several years of computer programming to understand how to actually create that bump process in a consistent manner off of our state structures. One thing I didn't mention is that bumping process has been done off of state highways and railroads, not off of local highways. And that is gonna, I think, a big question that has been raised all the time. And so that is one of the things that we outline in the procedure is that towns may request that this town highway be treated in a manner that's similar to what a state highway is. The river corridor be bumped off of that local highway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I've made my personal perspectives known about state versus local regulation on this topic. I'm always trying to find ways that we can compromise so that we're not putting it in buckets that are too quick for staff to be able to manage and to have staff capacity to do it. Could you see a world in which we expanded the scope of what the state regulates for transportation? So right now you have public utilities, agriculture, transportation at the state level. You don't have local transportation or local roadways. Is there a way that we could move it so that the state is now having to regulate the town highways for, other definitions of roads or rail, for example, that could expand it, but it takes some of the burden off towns?
Well-
Or would that just be too,
I think there's two pieces of that coming to mind. One is, I talked about that bumping process is giving more space to these, rivers and then how that protects downstream properties. So there would be an advantage to including more town highways in that bumping process.
yeah,
But having said that, from a regulatory standpoint, I don't know that you gain much in terms of regulating local roads, because generally towns aren't moving those roads, they're just doing regular maintenance.
okay,
And what we're really talking about from a river corridor standpoint, again, public safety, is people putting their home
okay.
in a river corridor. So
I'm trying to think through ways
Well,
that we can kind of expand your scope to take some of the burden off municipalities, but it sounds like that isn't I'll move on.
it would,
It's regulated by our stream alterations board. Most municipal roads that are culverts, bridges are regulated by our stream alterations board.
but that rule does not touch whether someone puts their house.
It's just a guidance versus
Well,
a,
it regulates what happens in stream, and it prohibits berms in the river corridor. Municipality or a landowner that wants to, berm up the river. Would be in violation of the freedom of operation rule vis-a-vis the post-Abbey legislation. So you would gain something from a lowering risk if more roads were looked at, more corridor bumping were to occur off of the town highways, but you wouldn't necessarily gain any additional, adjacent public safety by regulating habitable structures.
okay,
So thank you so much for all that, and I have the feeling we might have a few more questions as we need to over time. And sorry for you're here, but we didn't have you officially on the list as a witness. Do you want to, join us at the table and talk a little bit about things? Chip in on this morning's conversation on mapping and finding a path forward.
And while she's getting settled, I'd just like to make a couple of follow-on comments to what Mike said and Senator White's question. Again, it's that piecemeal development that is sub-jurisdictional under Act 250 and the rule. A lot of, piecemeal residential development that, creates tremendous risk for the development and the new channel management commitments that create or additional that we're concerned about. I guess I just want to remind, going back to Secretary Moore's testimony from last week, the vision of the state taking over for the mapped river corridors, or that regulatory role through our flood hazard area and river corridor rule is supported. It's just the timeline. It's that timeline. I'd go back to her slide deck. I can share it here if you want, but she provided a timeline with a 5 or 6 year glide path to get at that mapping, that infill mapping, which I think is going to align and intersect with some of the land use mapping done under Act 250 for planned development areas. The robust education and outreach that we need to do to landowners and to people around a much more buttoned up and robust map amendment revision process, time to amend the rule, staff up, all of that. So again, the administration supports the vision. It's the timeline that's really critical, because what doesn't feel workable right now to us is the way the language in the bill as introduced.
thank you, that's great.
Well, thank you, and because we're gonna continue working on it this week, and there's enough for us left to do that I can see, practically speaking, I think probably we'll need 2 days out of next week, but even if it's Wednesday, there's still, we're gonna be iterating like the timeline and the language and stuff pretty vigorously for a few days to get there. On the administration side, who are our best partners for as we try to figure out the glide paths? Should we be, I mean, I keep Deputy Secretary Gendron in the loop. And I don't know if we should just do it that way, or in general, it's going to be the two of you that will end up helping us with this.
Yeah, Rebecca and I can provide the programmatic detail, and so I think being in the room is helpful when you get to a place of doing any markup, if you're contemplating markup. Aside from Deputy Secretary Gendron, and I guess continue to coordinate through her, I think our Associate General Counsel Hannah Smith would be participating in that too.
Right. Thank you for that reminder. She was here this morning for a while, and then and she's apparently coming back. Okay, great. Back to you, it's fine.
Well, I didn't have anything prepared. I guess I'm just available to answer questions that you may have. And for the record, Rebecca Pfeiffer, the state NFIP coordinator, and our state floodplain team.
And I'm also for the time being. Senator Watson.
Thank you. You alluded to that you all have like a buyout program that you do. I've got a half-baked idea that I'm trying to like ground truth, which is that it would be lovely, coming out of these floods, if there was like a list of projects that the state was doing, or I know that there's different partners that do flood resiliency type projects moving forward. I don't know if the list of buyouts that you all have applications for or whatever, I don't know if that's a public list. I don't know if you have other projects that you all are initiating in terms of like, we're planning to, lower the banks over here so the river has better access to its floodplain. I don't know if that is something that you do, or do you outsource that work?
A little bit of all of it. So we don't actually manage any specific program, but are partners to other programs that do that work. So the buyouts are mainly done through Vermont Emergency Management. I think of her as my counterpart, Stephanie Smith, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, the SHMO. That's the SHMO. It's the shorthand. So Stephanie Smith manages the buyout program under FEMA. And she also manages the state appropriated flood resilient community fund that was using ARPA funding.
Okay.
That fund is out of funding
Yep.
right now. And there are, I think, other bills around about that.
I have heard about those.
But so she would probably be the best person to get a list of the actual buyouts and what is public when. I'm not sure when that becomes public or not. Because it deals with flood insurance and things like that. So flood insurance and knowing what flood insurance policies exist are like protecting privacy information. I don't know exactly when that process makes it public knowledge or not. Our river science team, so I'm like looking at Mike, but our river science team, I think a lot of our funding for like more floodplain restoration type program projects, we also have a river corridor easement program. And I can speak a little bit about that, and Rob also obviously jump in as you see fit, but when we're doing more natural resource focused projects, they come through the Flood Resilient Communities Fund through VEM, funding through there. There's also funding under Act 76 for the clean water service providers. There's also Fish and Wildlife has different habitat grants, and then not them like Rob, you may have that at hand. And I think those are most of the funds that we operate through.
Yeah, no, I think you covered most of it. And the one thing I just want to, aside from funding, and I think you've heard this in previous testimony, but it's important to reinforce is, of course, we're focused after the 2023 flood year on flood resilience and climate adaptation, as we should be every year here on after. But, we made significant commitments to our clean water goals too. And river corridor protection through regulation is the primary commitment. If you look at the TMDL implementation plan and the river section authored by Mike Klein a number of years ago, that was the primary commitment. Like we're not gonna get there by yellow machines alone. The scale of this is too big. And so, again, the river corridor regulation contemplated here for the mapped river corridors makes good on that commitment regarding our clean water objectives.
And that's where our river corridor easement program really came out of, is an acknowledgement that in some places where the river is significantly dynamic and there's conflict, we're basically buying that river the river channel management rights. So providing some compensation for a landowner, just like any sort of other conservation easement, they're committing to not managing the channel within that river corridor. And they get compensation basically for the loss of that development and channel management right of the land. And that's a program that, Mike created, and can probably speak much more eloquently about it, but it's been a really important tool in our toolbox to have that conversation with landowners, to be able to provide some level of compensation. If it's this area that we're saying this is a dynamic and a dangerous public safety hazard, we have the ability to provide a buyout of that land, so you're getting some compensation for it. And it's a voluntary program.
Thank you. One of the things that we have not talked about yet, but I'm hoping that we can talk about soon, is a study that would look at the possibility of modifying current use to include floodplain management. And maybe we could even think about it as like river corridor management as a potential accepted use of the land. Do you see that as competing with the river easement program or complementary?
I mean, I would see that as a complement, it's another tool in the toolbox. And I think current use is a way that provides some limit, and I'm not an expert in current use by any means, but it provides some limit on the person's ability, but it's not a permanent easement like something like a river corridor easement is. So I think it's a complementary tool. Where some people might say, I don't know if I want to give up a full, like my actual property rights and being easement in perpetuity, but maybe they'd be willing as that landowner to provide that. And I think that there is that link to, there is a public benefit to having agricultural fields and floodplains and allowing them to flood, so that it's not a town there. There are benefits to having floodplains in ag land, and I think that could be another tool of acknowledgement of that public benefit.
Thank you.
Right, it's an interesting one. I mean, the other thing was Mike Snyder used to regularly remind us how often people who were in current use as they aged and then said, well, what's the ultimate long-term disposition of my lane gonna be? Then they would move into permanent protection. So it can be a gateway into conservation. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all for your time.
All right, we're gonna shift gears a little bit, and go to the most patient guest of the year.
If we're gonna end the meeting now.
I'm gonna be short
Miss
too.
Dilly, I think this is like your third visit to the chair. There's no stop clock set or shot clock going, so.
It's okay, understand.
And a fair amount has happened on wetlands since you were last sitting.
Yes, true. I'm just going, so I wanted to, Karina Daly, restoration ecologist for VNRC, for the record, thank you for having me. The purpose of my testimony today is really to go through the wetlands portion of the bill with you. So moving from rivers back to wetlands, all part of our freshwater, intact freshwater systems bill climate resilience mantra. And go through the wetlands portion of the bill that O'Grady went through with you yesterday, and recognize those areas where We support the agency's recommendations and wanting to just talk those through with you. Okay, so I can pull it up on my screen and share it if that's the easiest, or if you have it in front of you, we can do it that.
I think we all have a hard copy from our walkthrough yesterday.
Okay.
Which were great.
Okay, perfect.
Maybe I think we all had a hard copy.
Right, 2.1.
Draft 2.1, yep. And the wetland section is the first. Oh, that's fine. So we should be good. So section 9.01, the water resource management. We recognize that the word wetlands was taken out of that title for that section. Page one,
She's on
section 9.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Section 1, 9.2. So the word wetlands was taken out of that section and we support that change. That was the recommendation by the agency, just their comment was that it was redundant. And as long as the water resources definition here is consistent with the Vermont water quality standard definition, I think that makes sense, and I think Michael O'Grady confirmed that yesterday, so just sharing.
Already included.
Exactly, wetlands are considered a water resource already. And then the next section, 9.16, the update of the Vermont significant wetlands inventory map. This section, few different things were changed, but most significantly was the language under B, which was the update to the NWI mapping happening every 5 years concurrent with the basin, tactical basin plan. So that language, the agency recommended that we change that language to evaluate the need for those updates so that they don't have to make the updates if they're not warranted. And I think that makes total sense, because in some cases, the need might not be there. So that was an additional change, as well as recommended by US Fish and Wildlife Service, so it's just the agency's just recognizing and adding that language that US Fish and Wildlife Service is the agency that completes the National Wetlands Inventory mapping and manages that data set. So they're the ones that would make that recommendation.
And forgive me, I've been hanging around lawyers too much lately. And they get away with just evaluating the need and saying, yeah, there needs to be an update, but then not update.
That's a good
Should
question.
we say evaluate the
The
need
need
and evaluate it needed?
Yes. Right now, it says about the agency shall evaluate the need for tactical basin map updates. I wonder about that as well. I would defer, I'm not an attorney, but I think that is a good recommendation.
Well, we have to Smith in the room, so either, I don't know if you wanna jump in, or you just wanna like flag it and we'll come back.
Sure, Hannah Smith for the record, this was the agency's language, the intent was that we would evaluate the need and then fulfill that need, but if there's additional language needed to make that clear.
It's a little bit of that.
We get a belt and suspenders here, okay? Thank you.
Yeah, moving down section 918, that is not this is our language, this is to us the most important language in the wetlands portion of the bill is the net gain of wetlands. And for reasons that I've stated previously, ANR is already doing an excellent job of this with their wetland loss to wetland gain ratio in their development, related to development and wetland impacts. And we just want to recognize that in statute and make it a policy. I will share that Michael O'Grady did recognize or have expressed concern with the word development under line 20. And we're happy to change that. Remove that word and replace it with impact. Or, defer to your recommendations there, but we can change that word as needed. I think impact would be a good replacement.
Is that because development is defined elsewhere in the law?
Well, we went into detail on development related to the floodplain mapping, the federal definition. We didn't go into it here, but I think it raises concern.
Maybe I think Michael Grady might have used the phrase uses or activities.
Yeah, and I did spend some time looking at the wetlands rules yesterday, and activity was not defined in the wetlands rules as well. I can't remember about it since I don't know about it.
So we'll find in language.
Yeah. And he also expressed concern about using the 5,000 square foot threshold for impact. And that was something that that recommendation had come from the agency, the wetlands program, and that is consistent with the Army Corps of Engineers. So that's a permit threshold right now that exists from the general permit to the individual permit. So that's why we chose that number. And so we would like to continue to support that 5,000 square foot, because I think it helps simplify permit changes down the road.
What was upgrading this?
As I recall, he wasn't sure. And correct me if other people heard differently, but he said that 2,500 square feet was used in the wetlands legislation prior, and that's a number that was, so he was thinking that that might be more typical, but I would defer to others, you can't speak to that.
Was it a significant, like class 1 wetland disturbance threshold?
This is Hannah Smith again. There are a couple different thresholds that might be at issue here. There is a threshold for identifying class 2 wetlands, that certain wetlands, the wetlands over a certain size meet a categorical classification that they're significant. The 5,000 square feet is the threshold under which you're eligible for general permit coverage. So that is sort of the way that the general permit for wetlands is drafted. It assumes that certain impacts will not have undue adverse effects, so you qualify for general permitting. I may have a similar question to Mike, where I'm not sure if this means that the permitted activity impacts more than 5,000 square feet, or the wetland is over 5,000 square feet. I guess I'm not clear whether we're talking about the wetland size or the size of the permitted activity.
Okay, so. Well, do you have a recommendation on which of those interpretations makes most sense to you?
I think that currently the agency's position on this piece is that we don't support modifications to the permitting requirements. So I don't have a recommendation. I think that the agency's position is we would continue to implement the permitting program as it exists. And that said, if we are talking about a modification to that regulatory program, I believe that we would be looking at an impact that's greater than 5,000 square feet, not the size of the wetland itself, right? Because the idea being that the larger the more significant the impact, or the more significant the loss of wetland, the more important that compensation is.
So, and I will just say that we would concur with that it's the impact versus the size of the product. So it's.
So, the clarifying language is what will be helpful.
And then moving on to page 6, section 919, the wetlands program report. That section was revised based on the agency's recommendations. To include, or to basically break up the reporting requirements. So that we have these annual reporting requirements based on the location and acreage of the class 2 wetland, and so the wetland gain and wetland loss. The number of site visits, permits processed, enforcement actions, and summary of mitigation off-site versus on-site and in fee. So those would be annually provided, and then on a 5-year basis, some of the more sort of historical data on wetlands and how wetlands are changing. So the historical trends on wetlands, as well as the NWI mapping, would be on a 5-year basis.
Right, and Mr. O'Grady pointed out that section under A5 was just an unintended duplication of verbiage. So smart being struck.
Oh, yeah,
Ms. Smith.
so there will be no
um,
section.
Do you have, I don't know if you're, here to speak on behalf of the agency on these suggested changes, that redefinition of the report and breaking out one versus the annual versus the 5-year reporting requirements work for the agency. Do you have suggested changes for that?
I believe that this reflects what the agency had proposed.
Yeah.
I didn't do a side by side
Okay.
last night, but I think that we did promote, there are certain data points that the agency already collects annually and reports to EPA. And this is consistent with that annual reporting requirement. We'd just be providing that to the legislature as well.
Sure.
And then this more comprehensive 5-year review would dive into the scope of the regulatory program and yes.
Okay.
I think it's consistent with the agency's proposal.
Okay, so all are clear and
And I'm all set there. That's all I have. That completes the wetlands portion.
So like the anticipation,
Not very long for. Thank you.
okay,
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Nick, I'd like to ask Lauren Boots to join us again. So I have been saying, talking to various parties who are helping us craft the legislation, you know, it's like, we're interested in a bill that sort of wins on the merits, not like whose idea was it? We'll just keep assembling the best ideas and put together that overall, you know, light path. So Ms. Oates went back to drawing board some and did some more thinking about how we might reconceive of some things to move forward. And so I appreciate that because there's nothing like thinking about it and writing it down that helps us figure out whether how to make something better and whether or not we're in agreement about what the better might be. So with that, take it away.
Before I start, I saw my friend Seth Jensen's name in the Zoom box and asked Jude if he intended to testify today. I think he was invited in so I did wanna, I know that I do this often, but I do wanna make space in case Seth, because he was here, wanted to speak, and I didn't know if he was intending to go after me or.
He's just gonna add to whatever you may.
So just jump in as I go?
Yes.
Okay, well, Seth, if you're still on and you've heard that, feel free to interject yourself during my testimony. For the record, Laura notes.
And you know, sorry, we might as well, Mr. Jensen, are you there?
Yeah.
We see your square, your Hollywood Square, but
Yes,
you
I am here, Chair. Thank you.
great. So if you could just reintroduce yourself for the record and then as inspired, jump in and do a little tag team with Oates' testimony.
All right. So I am Seth Jensen, Deputy Director of the Lamoille County Planning Commission.
Good to see you again. Thanks for coming back. All right, back to you, Ms. Oates.
Great. Lauren Oates, Director of External Affairs with the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. Thank you for having me back in today. As Chair Bray mentioned, after listening to quite a bit of testimony from several of us in the room, as well as agency staff, and in recognition of pretty significant differences, I'll say, between the river corridors and floodplains, both in the hazard potential, the fluvial geomorphology of each, scientific details, as well as how those spaces are currently regulated or otherwise administered. I wanted to make a recommendation that hopefully checks the boxes of some of the testimony we've heard, which is essentially to separate the two out. Right now, as proposed, S213 says that the flood hazard area river corridor rule will be expanded to incorporate jurisdiction for the agency for both the MAP river corridor and the FEMA MAP special flood hazard area, or just flood hazard area. And the proposed changes that I can pull up on my screen now, aim to remove the floodplain from consideration for jurisdiction now from the state, and recommend that there be a legislative study committee that really looks into the intricacies of the National Flood Insurance Program, how that may or may not interact with the CFR that has the NFIP underneath it, just acknowledging that there's a lot more at play administratively with the red tape around floodplains than there are river corridors. In the hopes that that also will give the agency and impacted folks like Seth and the regional planning commissions and municipalities time to really think about what an expanded or state administered national flood insurance program might look like. That will also reduce the FTE burden that we've been hearing from agency staff. Testimony from the agency said that in order to incorporate river corridors, the MAP river corridor regulation, that would be a 4 FTE need versus the 15 or 20 that we might expect for a floodplain. So that would significantly reduce the burden while also addressing, again, our 80% problem of the river corridors by incorporating that jurisdiction now. So I'm going to, unless there are questions on that as a general idea, share my screen and show some proposed text for what that might look like. I have both proposed changes to S213 and another image, a timeline of reporter. That's beautiful. They were printed out. Thank you, Jude. I will share my screen. I want to acknowledge I only had access to the Word version of the previous text, but I believe the yellow highlight is what you already have now in version 2.1. And I will skip over wetlands and dams, really just focus on this section. Is this large enough for you all?
No.
Great. So the yellow has been incorporated into 2.1, MAP river corridor. My proposed text changes will be in red, track changed. So you'll see anywhere currently where we say the permitting for river corridor and flood hazard area. I propose that we remove flood hazard area, which is the floodplain.
What page?
So this is page.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, my number, you probably said, thank you.
Oh, you're on section 8.
Section 8, you got it. Which is page 11. Yes. So this would essentially keep language as is for the river corridor and remove the floodplain from authorizing state-based permits. Okay. So that is, you'll just see like a quick little removal of flood hazard area and just in keeping with MAP river corridor. And then in the rulemaking section, an addition number 6 to recommend how those 4 FTEs might be funded. So the proposed language is the secretary shall propose to the General Assembly funding sources to support 4 permanent full-time classified positions in the DEC Rivers Program to establish and implement the river corridor permitting program as described above in this bill, which shall include a proposed fee for permit applications to develop the river corridors based on criteria and locations established in that aforementioned river corridor base map. infill mapping process.
So we're asking the agency to find a funding source for it, is that, or with it?
Ideally, the agency would come up with a recommendation for what a proposed fee for permit application might look like. That would be similar to how both the wetlands and lakes and ponds programs are currently funded. Their staff are funded through their permitting program, so the DEC Rivers program is the one water-based program that doesn't have their own permitting program that establishes fees to support their time, so they are all generally funded, as I understand it, looking at the agency and previous agency staff in here. So that really goes to look back at. This is how wetlands, lakes and ponds do it. Is there a similar solution that can be made to account for these 4 additional MT corridors?
That's great.
Yeah, we'll keep going.
Very good.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, that what's very helpful as we were talking about pulling the program apart so that we have more pieces to stage over a timeline and provide space by staging the pieces differently. And then also address the funding issues, because when you permit fees can help fund the activity. I mean, there's, my understanding of fees is always that whatever you regulate, and you do it with fees, you support the program through fees that just covers the program. So we end up taking ourselves out of the looking for money out of the general fund, yet again, knowing that everyone this year is leading into getting money from the general fund.
Okay. And it's strange to call it fortunate, but because the river corridor is the far more hazardous area for development, we are generally rather fortunate that it's the less complicated and less FTE needed to address the problem, so that we can really move forward with that as is currently in the bill, and then take our time to really understand the implications of what either a proposed state floodplain standard might look like and or a state administered national health insurance program would look like.
Thank you. I just wanted to notice out loud that your changes have not changed the definition of development, so it's still referencing the federal definition. But it sounds like, I know, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm staying true here, that at least the current rules that you all have around river corridors, there's a lot of accepted kinds of development, so to speak, at least, thinking about like the plowing and the forestry. And so you could, the things that are problematic are like buildings, basically, if it impedes speed of the river, or I forget what the other thing is, but so I'm just wanting to check in to say, does the definition of development seem problematic to you in applying this in a broader way across the state?
I guess generally in floodplains, the definition of development is broad by necessity. Because you look at things that impact flood heights and flooding, inundation flooding. In river corridors, we tend to use the word more of improvement. So trying to separate a little bit from development so that it's not quite as all encompassing, but I think from it, like a land alteration, Mike referenced that berms in river corridors are still a concern. Berms are like fill or other material to try to keep water away, but it also has impacts on the function and movement of the stream. And again, Rob, you can obviously chime in as well, but it's, we're still looking at a lot of activities on the ground. It's not like the farmer putting a cloud in their fields. But if they're doing large scale alterations of the field, like we've had proposals to do permanent greenhouses or, more substantial greenhouses or new farm structures, barns, things like that, or alterations to the field in the farming practice. And those are things that may still fall under jurisdiction of the rule. And I guess just generally right now, our rule is looking at both inundation and river corridors. And so we are kind of making that triage, I guess, of what is the most restrictive standard that applies in these cases. It would be that I'm looking at through both classes. So I don't know if that helps at all, but.
It does, but I'm wondering if it makes, and this is a question to everybody, like, does it make sense to leave the definition of development, or does it make sense to use improvement? And I'm sure that's a policy decision, but I just wanna understand the implications of using those.
What our triggers are.
Right, I just wanna know what would be implicated if we use a different word there.
I would imagine that we would probably advocate to stay with the definition of development because it has such close ties to the flood hazard area and to the NFIP. And rulemaking could be a way of trying to figure out a way forward of what are the types of activities that would be regulated and that would be non-reported or not, or exempt from permitting, would be my. Not being a lawyer, but that would probably be my guess as an approach to take.
Okay, thank you, that's very.
Also, not being a lawyer, I agree with that.
Okay.
And would think that through the rulemaking, especially in that infill mapping provision where it says identify areas suitable for development, that would be a significant part of that conversation and process.
Cool, thank you.
So then we get into the timeline, and I've made some changes, so I'm going to stop my screen share the visual that Jude happily printed out for me. Thank you again, Jude. Kind of show a couple of shifts based on just again hearing the needs and demands on the agency currently, and also wanting to really balance that with the public safety concern that we have and the need to address that as soon as is possible while supporting a strong robust education and outreach and mapping process. So this kind of, it looks similar to what the agency presented last week, kind of using their same timeline, but shifting the dates a bit. So it's basically 1.5 years for mapping process, about 1.5 years for the rulemaking, about 1.5 years for education and outreach, with the intended end goal being at the start of 2027, that is when the implementation of that expanded only river corridor permitting program would take place. Recognizing again that I'm proposing that we pull out the floodplains to do a study around that, looking at the timeline there too.
Right, any committee questions for Ms. Oates, and Mr. Jensen, you're with us? I don't know if you want to, contribute to the conversation, having listened in to the proposal of how we might disentangle these things and sequence them.
Sure, I will speak very briefly to that out of respect to all of your time and appreciate you opening some time for me. So I think that disentangling river corridors from flood hazard areas makes a lot of sense. I've worked professionally with a lot of communities updating their flood hazard bylaws to be consistent with FEMA standards. And it's complicated both in drafting and in administration. The original approach of having state involvement in the permitting and administration process, I think, had some merit, but clearly needs some thought. So a study committee makes sense for flood hazards while moving forward with a unified approach to river corridors. What we have now, which is the piecemeal approach of town by town or Act 250 jurisdiction versus non-jurisdiction, is not really working in terms of a watershed approach to protecting river corridors, and which are by nature multi-town, regional, watershed wide. And so separating those out where there's more agreement and a clearer path makes sense. The biggest issue that we have seen related to local uptake of river corridors really does have to do with what happens when there's a river through a village in downtown. And the language that was included in the most recent version, which is the collaborative approach of ANR working with ACCD and the regional planning commissions to map out those areas, makes a lot of sense. The timeline is a bit accelerated, but kind of, as I said last time I spoke to you and the Committee on Housing, we needed to start doing this work in 1995. And so it's 2024, we need to start now. So that accelerated timeline for that mapping gives me a little bit of anxiety, but it's the type of anxiety you get when it's something that you need to get done and get done.
Senator Watson?
Thank you. I have a question for Lauren. So I'm just looking at this timeline, trying to digest it. So this is a timeline for the roadmap to getting river corridors permitting up and running.
Yes.
Is there, are we, and, okay, I'm just recalling now that, so you said for the flood hazard areas, it's a set.
And I have proposed language for that.
Okay.
It's very dry, as you can imagine, but I'm happy to, it's on the, I can look at you.
I just wanted to make sure, and I also just want to appreciate what Steph was saying about. We need to do this,
Yeah.
30 years ago, but.
And I think that.
Like, this is a realistic timeframe. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
what I just recommended to this timeline, actually, it might help give Seth a little less agita because it does shift things back, I think, by 6 months mostly, so. Right now, I think the mapping process was only scheduled for a year, this gives it a year and a half. And I think that, again, it tries to really balance the need to have done this in 1995 because public safety is on the line and wanting to keep it well so that we don't create more problems to ourselves in 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thumbs
up from Seth. You can see it.
Yeah.
Well, and so one question I have is, in the two different things we want to get done, both things, but flood hazard area work with engaging municipalities. We've a state standard rule and or bylaws, and then all the engagement to actually implement. I'm guessing, but I don't want to be guessing. Is that a more intensive engagement with the municipality than if they're implementing the river corridor rule? I don't know if I'm imagining it as one, anyway, that's the question. I don't know if we're easing the path forward in some, because the river corridor rule implementation is, if in some sense, a narrower conversation with the municipalities. I don't know.
Go ahead.
Rebecca, for the record, there are two different groups of people that you're reaching out to. So with flood hazard area regulations, you're mostly working with planning commissions. Making sure town plans are up to snuff and then enabling the adoption of higher floodplain standards. So that eventually goes to select board, possibly to town meeting vote. So it's a long drawn out process, but you're engaging with the town officials on that conversation. And they also have the hook of needing to have those updated by the time new FEMA maps come out. Otherwise they get suspended from the program that they've mapped out. And flood insurance is no longer available to anyone in the community to renew their policies. For river corridors, it's a different constituency because you're reaching out to landowners who would be affected by new rules regulating their land. And I think that's a much broader conversation. With Lakeshore taking that as a model or a lesson learned for the Lakeshore encroachment permits. It was a very broad outreach that people knew this permit was coming online. What did it mean for their property? How does that affect what they can and can't do? When does the permit come into effect? So I think it's a very different type of engagement. And another concern I have is that we wouldn't be under the proposed, I'm not speaking for the agency, but just initial reaction is that we wouldn't be having permit fees coming into effect until after January 2027.
Right.
But I'd say bulk of the work is happening on the front end to map and to outreach. And
And I
that's
think I was thinking about sitting here looking at that thing. So there would be startup money.
Yeah, so the agency's proposal had included money, contractual funding to do the mapping work, because to do it in-house would be a really big list. So I think it would be people and staff in-house to support, also then a contractual effort to do the mapping with RPCs and ECCD in the current proposal. And then there would be, if we're using shoreline encroachment permit as an example, kind of like the roadshow of going to different towns, having public meetings, advertising. And all of that work, so we would probably need staff for that as well to support it.
So, I know this is like new for everyone in the room, but I think if people can take that timeline in and have conversations once we adjourn, and I'd love to follow up with people. Honestly, by the sooner the better, if I can get that initial reaction by like end of day, something like that, then we can start to think about how we might take next steps, but we'll have time again this week to come back to this, look at more language, sharpen things, think aloud together about the whole thing, that we need that startup money, because long term, we're creating, I hope, a durable program, current fees would fund it. But we need to get to that point, and to your point about the shoreline work, which I remember the road show, and so I'd love to hear if you think that education and outreach timeline that is up there also, is enough time to reach all the people we need to reach. And I think at the same time, I want us to be a little bold about pushing ourselves along, because constituents want us, every time we get another catastrophic flood event, and have expectation that we are gonna move a little out of our comfort zone and developing programs, policies, implementation at business as usual speeds, and lean into it in a way where if we all support each other, we can go faster. And that's what I'm philosophically, practically trying to orient kids to.
Well, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to add on to what you're saying, which is the public safety concerns that we're talking about are real. And the fact that we had flooding in the summer, that we had flooding in December, this is just now the reality that we will be living in. So I respect that there's going to be growing pains as we try to articulate the timeline, but we are not in a position where I think we can wait to have these types of conversations in our towns any longer, because the risk of life, property, and ability to make decisions as communities is on the line. And I know we have towns like Weston who are hungry to get guidance on what to do, because it's stalled them in their ability to make decisions. So this is really important, and I appreciate that we're going to have a tougher conversation potentially with the agency about what they feel is manageable, but I really appreciate your leadership on this, because I don't think we can move any slower.
And can I just offer a friendly amendment to Ms. Viper's comment about the timing on getting the FTEs in? There would be nothing, hopefully, that would preclude the 4 or even part of those 4 additional staffers from beginning before January 2027. I would hope that some, if not all of them, would be on beforehand to be part of the education and outreach. And as proposed in the language today, that study or the secretary shall be directed to identify a permit fee structure for this new program. That would be part of rulemaking, which would necessarily need to end by January 2026. So knowing that hiring, especially government hiring, could take some time, ideally there would be staff on well before January 2027.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the funding.
Yeah.
To pay for the positions before we're collecting funds.
For the record, my client, I can't quite read over Lauren's shoulder to see the timeline, but the one thing that I think would be really critical is to have mapping done before you start the public outreach process. You go out to the public and say, this other stuff is coming and maybe it will affect you and maybe it won't. Total chaos.
Yeah.
And a waste of time. So I think you would want to timeline so that your mapping with the regional planning commissions is largely complete. You have a draft proposal. And you can be more clear to the public if you're really going to engage them at that level.
And I think what you just said, I agree with, but because you said that you go out with a really robust draft map, that is why there's that 6-month proposed overlap. So that if anything comes out, it's like all of the municipalities are like, you really missed A, B, and C, there's time for that mapping process to kind of make sure that they go back and take in that public input from municipalities.
So robust maps that are still.
Really solid
amendable.
drafts that are still amendable with time to really incorporate any feedback that couldn't have been done by the RPCs representing municipal voice on the mapping process front.
Well, so both points well taken, you know, figure, we can develop an implementation timeline that works along both those lines. Anything else that you have that you want to share? So thank you for doing that work. Taking a conversation into a concrete language and a timeline. And I don't know if anyone else in the room wants to contribute, or Chair McDonald, you have something you're moving and your eyes are looking at me in a way that suggests a question.
One of the things we're doing here is constantly referring to the floods we had last summer. And are we preparing for the next time the floods we had last summer happen again? Or are we preparing for the floods that will surpass what happened last summer? And that's the weakness or the flaw in our planning is that whatever happened last summer was unprecedented. And we're preparing for what already happened. How do we prepare for what is going to happen that hasn't happened yet? And we never measure that, or it's heading in a direction and we're not accounting the next steps, and we're planning for last year's war.
As proposed, the river corridor language would say we're removing this vulnerability entirely, so yes, it's addressing it. The floodplain piece, because we're now proposing a larger phase in for a study, I think we'll have the opportunity to make sure that we're looking at those FEMA minimum standards, which are not addressing the floods of today or tomorrow especially, and figuring out how we might address those better through ideally a state administered program. So I think yes, that is what this bill is proposing to do.
But our discussion of the bill hasn't discussed that. It's always what happened last summer. And the summer before last, we weren't anticipating that.
Hey, and I had a bill on the wall about it proactively.
Well, so Ms. Piper, you were talking about like, and it'll be Mr. Clemens too, about when you're in the fringe, do you build a foot above the field level? Do you build 2 feet or 3 feet? Do you build a hardened structure so that we might address what Senator McDonald's bringing up? Mr. Denson.
I just wanted to thank the senator for that question. And I think that question about what level of additional protection should be incorporated for planning for more intense floods is something that would make a lot of sense to include in as part of the study committee that's been proposed. In Lamoille County, our regional plan recommends at least 2 feet of freeboard or the 500-year level, whichever is greater. That's advisory language, not regulatory language. But in terms of just to give an example, project implementation, we're currently working with the village of Wolcott on a village wastewater project that is aimed in part of removing all of the existing on-site septic systems that are located within the floodplain and river corridor in the village to an area that's outside in an indirect discharge soil-based system that will be flood-proofed to at least, all of the system components will be flood-proofed to at least a 500-year level. So I think that the senator raises a really important consideration for regulation as well as infrastructure investment.
Well, thank you. It's good to hear that these things are both the question and that it's already happening in some instances. Senator McCormick.
Thanks. I think people whose feet are on the ground and are actually doing the work have good reason to not like hearing from other people that they should hurry up. And I appreciate that. But I noticed education and outreach to start in July 2025. Floods that have most touched off this activity were in July of 2023, so that's 2 years after. Now, we got people who are living with the ruination. I mean, it's there. Senator White mentioned Weston, and Weston stands out in part because it was so badly damaged, but also because the people there really are looking to the state. They're asking us. And we've gone down there, and frankly, I think all we accomplished was public relations. That wasn't our motive. But that, I don't know if we accomplished much more than that. And then you have other towns with their own town personalities, you know, some that are sort of more developed and they figure that, thank you, state, but we got it under control. And then others who are, you know, don't need to stay here. But all three are gonna be implicated in this and need our cooperation. I wish we could be doing the outreach earlier. At least for those, as there are towns that if we do outreach, they'll have to go away. But there are towns, Weston being one, that we would be more than welcome. And they want to hear from us. They also have ideas.
Yes.
And we would learn from them. And in fact, so when I talk about the towns who say to the state and just go away, there's a reason for that. They have a feeling that they're doing it. They're taking care of business, and Montpelier comes down and tells them what to do. And as opposed to coming down and consulting and working together to create a program. Is there no way to start outreach earlier than
So the,
the law?
There's more than one outreach program.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what I'm gonna say, just,
If we're currently working, we have money from our FEMA grant that we have, actually LCPC, the Loyal County Planning Commission is our sub grantee and then sub grants to all the RPCs to do outreach right now on river corridors and floodplains. While we're engaging towns about bringing their floodplain standards to minimum standard, our lead is river corridors and floodplains create a full understanding of flood risk. So we are doing that outreach with the Regional Planning Commission. We've been doing that since I've ever worked in this program, that we always talk about both with towns. You know, admittedly, with the regional planning commissions, most planning commissions are prioritizing the towns that want to have the conversation. And so that's where we tend to have those first meetings, and this is the second year of the sub-grant, but we're anticipating it to be for several years to lead up to the bylaw updates with towns, and so. I think that it is happening, it's happening in the framework of your local regulations and how towns can do this. So it's not like it's a novel or new conversation. I think the change and shift in this timeline would be. The state would now actually be regulating it, and that's the difference in messaging versus rivers move, rivers are dynamic. And how do we look at the complete view of flood risk in your community that the NFIP maps are not providing, and the ANR maps. River corridor maps help to provide that. So I don't know if that helps. I think it's more a matter of like. Funding ability, resources at the regional planning commissions to partner with. We also partner with Sea Grant. Sea Grant, TNC, the Nature Conservancy have a shared municipal flood resilience educator position that we're working with to try to do more municipal outreach with Flume, the river and Fox and things like that. So there is some of that happening now. I think this is more in the context of like, there's new regulation that you'll have to come to us to get from the court.
he's fine, sorry. My client, and when I said earlier that I would focus the outreach once you have the revised maps, I wasn't trying to preclude.
Yes.
That there would be outreach before that, say, here's what's coming, here's how it would be structured. Procedures for carrying out these maps have been in place, that's what we what would generally be used, et cetera. But then to engage them in another round of outreach where you actually had maps. And those robust draft that you would present to the public, I think is what I was referring to earlier, is to time correctly.
But no, not just present to the public, but consult with again, getting back to the particular town where we mentioned, but I think we just mentioned Weston. I think Weston is an example of the same thing in many, many towns, which is people really don't like information meetings. They don't like turning out to find out, okay, here's what we've decided for you. And now we'll explain it to you. And then we'll explain why we're right. They don't want to hear that. They also don't want to hear, okay, listen, we represent you. Tell us what you want. And then it says, we don't know, we just had a flood, you're the one to
Right.
Okay, so what you want is consultations, a real serious discussion back and forth, and it's not a discussion designed to make people feel empowered. It's to have them actually be empowered.
Chris Campany spoke a fair amount about Weston, and I don't know if you've had any follow-up with him, because they're.
Say the name of the first name.
Chris Campany.
Oh, yeah.
Wyndham RPC. We seem very interested, and I think there was some combined effort going on with Londonderry.
Exactly.
Trying to find an answer, so
The
it'd
same-
be interesting to know, is anything we're talking about doing in this bill responsive to what I think he was hoping to hear more about? I'm gonna double back and reconnect, and
And we could say the same for many other towns that were
Yeah.
affected, Ludlow, I mean, like, the sentiment seems very similar in our communities, that they feel the municipal level, they're not able to tackle this problem. In a way that they feel they can accomplish.
yeah. It seems like it's like sometimes when you're working with someone and you ask for help. And they come over and they take over the project, it doesn't feel as good as when they actually help you. And I'm wondering if the dynamic that we're dealing with, wanting help, but not having it just taken over by the city.
I think we're actually hearing from people that they would wanna take it over by the state, like that is actually what I'm hearing. And I'm happy to be corrected, but the majority of towns that I'm hearing from are. Because of the regional relationship of this problem, feel that they don't have the ability to make decisions that take in enough factors.
And I would argue that the mapping process outlined in here, necessarily including the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, as well as the regional planning commissions. One, that you get those voices and perspectives in, and two, any good process that would meet, if I'm the RPC representative on there, I would probably reach out to my municipalities during and say, or through the backed up process writ large or structure, to say, we're 6 months in, what are we missing, or 10 months in, et cetera.
Yeah, everyone likes to edit, no one likes to write. So, and lots of them.
Thank you. I'm gonna come back to this idea of having a list of potential projects, and the reason is because. So just in terms of like, what are we doing, right, in response, and this feels like important and about as fast as we can go. It also feels like, okay, this is, gonna be a little bit further out. I wonder if we had a list of projects that we could point to, it's like, here are identified improvements that could be made that, we're gonna be working towards, and, just need, like a little bit of funding or whatever, that those may not actually be, short term, like this is starting to, I realize that 2027 is actually not that far away. But, in terms of like, we've had these 2 floods in the last, like, more or less 7 months, then, it starts to feel further away, right? And so what can we do in a shorter term? And even like these projects, like having a list of projects may not realistically be done in a short time, but it's something that we can like work towards now. Just thinking out loud.
Making it concrete.
Making it concrete, just right. To say like, we're doing these things, that are going to help in the long run, but like, what are things that we can do in the interim?
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. O'Grady and then Mr. Jensen.
The bill already requires the basement planning process to identify projects that for climate resiliency and flood mitigation. So that could be part
So
of the
that's-
basement planning process every 5 years.
Okay, do we know when those are up for renewal?
It rotates depending on the basin.
Okay.
What year was I read?
2011.
5 years, so we should have had, by 2016, we should have had, after 5 years, we should have had something in place.
You're requiring that those projects be a newly added component of the basement planning.
But I hear what you're saying,
Yeah.
there are these disparate projects, a lot of dam removals happen at the NGO level. A lot of buyouts are at the state, and then there are these floodplain restoration, wetland restorations that have broader community flood resilience value, so. Pulling those all and kind of saying, we are doing things now,
Right.
but again, those, I think I heard Mr. Evans say, those are like the yellow truck or machine solutions. That we need this kind of like, this is the solution to preventing having to do those.
They don't do that a lot.
Right. So, right, for us talking to constituents and our colleagues, probably it's worth pulling together that the concrete nearer term steps as well as. Because this is so oriented to paradigm shift, which is taking time. Mr. Jensen.
Thank you. I just wanted to offer that I believe we could probably pull together a list of projects in the queue along the Lamoille main stem that LCPC and our partners are working on. Our water quality planner is my office mate, but she is out today, so I can make that offer. But I do believe that's something we could pull together, at least a summary. It won't be all inclusive of things that may be, 10 years away, but you'll get a picture of what is in the queue for the next, 1 to 5 years.
And do all RPCs generally have such a list?
I think that it is something that we could work with VAPTA to pull together for, the main stems. Of at least, as Lauren noted, there are different organizations involved, but I think of projects that the RPCs are involved in is something that we could pull together. That may not include all the conservation districts or the dam removals. So as long as it's understood that it's not all inclusive, but we'll give you a picture of the work. Yep.
Yeah, okay, that's very helpful, thank you.
All right, so we are pretty much at time. Thank you everyone for a really educational and helpful, productive educational morning and a productive conversation about how we might construct this glide path. Again, for people who are on the receiving end, Ms. Smith, you're the representative in the room, and Piper, if you can take this back to your shots and start to get some feedback for us. You can give us a preliminary read by end of day, that would be helpful, just because it will help us shape what we do in committee tomorrow. And Ms. Oates, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Great to see you all again, and thank you for the help.